Hello and welcome back to the channel. It has been long. It has been too long since I've been able to get a video out. There's just been a lot of stuff going on in my life. I have been trying to rank up in the MTGA ladder. I have been trying to play more Commander in person. I've been trying to film more Commander videos. And I really just wanted to break up my cycle of not really getting a video out with a Commander quick look, with a Commander from New Cappenna. And it's a Commander that when it came out, it definitely rocked the boat. I heard a lot about it, and I just really wanted to dive into it because it's really different. It's Jund, as you can tell from the thumbnail and whatnot. We are going to be looking at the Beamtown Bullies. And I really wanted to take a look at this Commander because I think it just does something that Jund likes to do, which is interact with its own graveyard. But it does it in a really different way where you're putting stuff from your graveyard onto your opponent's battlefield and then making it hit other people. It's really cool, really interesting, this style of, hey, I'm going to give you stuff, be my friend. I'm going to give you something really good, and then you're going to hit someone else for me. So you're making someone else do your bidding as well as getting the benefit from that card. So you can either make that card harm an opponent or benefit you. So let's go ahead and read Beamtown Bullies. So it's 4 mana, 1 in Jund, so 1 black, red, green, for a 4/4 legendary creature, Ogre, Devil, Warrior. It has Vigilance and Haste, so we can tap it immediately when it comes in, or we can go to combat, hit someone, and then tap it in our second main phase. You don't have to pay to activate the ability, you just have to tap the Beamtown Bullies. So you tap the Beamtown Bullies, target opponent whose turn it is, puts target non-legendary creature card from your graveyard onto the battlefield under their control. It gains haste, goad it, at the beginning of the next end step, exile it. So there is a lot of periods there, a lot of definites there. So let's just go ahead and break this down. We get a 4/4 for 4, so it's a really good mana investment. It has Vigilance. Honestly, for some odd reason, I guess we could just go to combat and hit something, hit an opponent, try and get some combat damage in before we activate the Beamtown Bullies on our turn, or we can wait and do it on an opponent's turn at instant speed. So we tap it, target opponent, so we're going to choose one of our opponents. Then we have to choose a non-legendary card, and I think that's really important because I think a lot of people are going to look at some cool legends to throw in the deck, and then when they realize that they can't give your opponents a legendary card, you can only give them non-legends, so we need to make sure to keep that in mind moving forward. So we put it onto the battlefield. It gains haste and you goad it. So goading obviously is the mechanic where it has to attack someone other than you if able, and it has to attack. There's no holding it back. But honestly, goad in a 1v1, there's no one else to attack. So if you're giving someone, an opponent, a creature and it's just you, they have to attack you. It's goaded. The opponent can't hold it back. So you're not going to want to use the Beamtown Bullies if you're closing out the game in a 1v1. Then at the beginning of the next end step, if it hasn't died during combat, you exile it, and if it does die during combat, you still exile it. So you're just kind of getting these one-off effects. So we need to make sure that we are getting the best use out of our creatures because we're basically going to be able to do it one time, but we're going to definitely make sure to put a lot of stuff in this deck that is going to hit, and it's going to hit hard, where it's either going to enter and it's going to hurt someone by making them sacrifice something or making them lose life, or when it attacks, we could throw in some Eldrazi with some Annihilator so we can try and deal damage to our opponents, as well as the opponent who is attacking. They get to destroy stuff with the Annihilator triggers. And this is just going to go crazy as we move through the quick look. But the Beamtown Bullies is so interesting, and I really just wanted to make a video on it because, like I said in the beginning of the video, it's graveyard Jund, but I'm going to put some cool stuff in my graveyard, and then I'm going to give it to someone else. And you kind of get to pick and choose your strategy of what effects you're going to use to harm your opponents or help yourself by giving these weird, unplayed Jund creatures to your opponents. So let's get into the rest of the quick look. So the first section that we're going to be looking at in this quick look is going to be ways to fill our graveyard, because that is going to be the most important. Obviously, you have your classic discards like Thrill of Possibility or Faithless Looting, but I'm not really going to touch on those because you can put those in your deck if you want to. Just ways to discard things from your hand if you accidentally draw. But we're going to be talking more about how to get stuff in your graveyard consistently, how to tutor to your graveyard. And the first section we're going to talk about is dredging. So dredge is a really interesting mechanic. Dredge will be printed, and then there'll be a number next to dredge. And Dredge reads, if you would draw a card, instead you may put exactly this many, the Dredge number, from the top of your library into your graveyard. If you do, return this card with Dredge to your hand. Otherwise, you draw a card. So the first card we're going to look at is Stinkweed Imp. So for 3 mana, 2 and a black, you get a 1/2 flyer that says whenever Stinkweed Imp deals combat damage to a creature, destroy that creature. So it kind of has this death touch without it really being death touch. It doesn't say the keyword. And Stinkweed Imp has Dredge 5. So if we would draw a card, instead we may put exactly 5 cards from the top of our library into our graveyard. Then we draw Stinkweed Imp, which we can cast it and use it as a flying blocker to then die as it's weak, and then it will take out something else, and then we get to dredge a pretty big number. So that's going to fill our graveyard really quick. And moving on, as we've explained Dredge, we're going to be looking at the Golgari Cave Troll. So for 5 mana, 4 and a green, we get a 0/0. Golgari Cave Troll enters the battlefield with a 1/1 counter on it for each creature card in your graveyard, so hopefully we're going to have a lot of creatures. So this thing can be really big. We pay 1 colorless and remove a 1/1 counter from the Golgari Cave Troll, and we can regenerate it, so we can just bring it back to the battlefield instead of it hitting the graveyard. But more often than not, we're probably going to want to have it sit in the graveyard to get that Dredge 6. So, as I read Dredge before, and when we draw a card, we can choose to put 6 cards from the top of our library in our graveyard, and then we would technically draw the Golgari Cave Troll. We put that back into our hand. The other Dredge card we're going to be talking about is Golgari Thug. So for 2 mana, we get a 1/1. When Golgari Thug dies, put target creature card from your graveyard on top of your library. So this will be nice if we accidentally mill a creature that we want on our battlefield. So the Golgari Thug is actually doing 2 things at once. It's going to get back something that we wanted, as well as giving us the ability to dredge 4 to fill our graveyard with stuff that we want to give our opponents. Next is the classic Dredge card, Life from the Loam. So for 2 mana at sorcery speed, we can return up to 3 land cards from our graveyard to our hand, and it has Dredge 3. So if we accidentally dredge a bunch of lands, we don't really know how to get those back anymore. Life from the Loam is going to allow us to return those to our hands. It doesn't return it to the battlefield, which would be really broken, but it's going to allow us to get some stuff from our graveyard back to our hand to play it, and then we can dredge 3 to keep returning Life from the Loam, keep dredging, keep returning Life from the Loam, stay up on lands. Life from the Loam is obviously really good and pretty much an auto include in this deck. Now we'll be moving on from the Dredge section to a section where we're going to be tutoring stuff to our graveyard, or a way to just constantly and consistently fill our graveyard. So the first card we're going to talk about is Buried Alive. So for 3 mana, 2 and a black at sorcery speed, we're going to search our library for 3 creature cards and put them into our graveyard and then shuffle. Now, we get to choose the creatures, and obviously, comboing with Beamtown Bullies, we're going to give those creatures to our opponents. So we are going to get to choose 3 really nice creatures that we are going to give away. And this card, again, auto-include, it's uncommon. We need it in our deck. We get to choose 3 things that we're going to get out later in the game with our commander. Next is a rare called Unmarked Grave. So for 2 mana, it's 1 and a black at sorcery speed. We search our library for a non-legendary card, so it doesn't exactly have to be a creature, but we're going to more than likely choose a creature, put that card into your graveyard, and then shuffle. Next is Auric Loremage, a rare from Strixhaven. So for 2 black at 4 mana, it's a 3/3 human warlock that has a tap ability. You don't pay anything, so tap the Auric Loremage. Search your library for a card and put it into your graveyard, then shuffle. If it's an instant or sorcery, you put a 1/1 counter on Auric Loremage, but it's a card. So we can go grab a Dredge card, we can go grab our Life from the Loam if we wanted to, but more often than not, again, it's going to be a creature. Next is Jared's Orders. So for 2 and Golgari, 2 black-green at sorcery speed, search your library for up to 2 creature cards, put 1 into your hand and 1 into the graveyard. Obviously, we can already see how powerful this is. We get to put in our hand something that we want, and then in our graveyard, something we're going to give away. Next is the Vile Entomber. So for 4 mana, 2 black, it's a zombie warlock with Death Touch. When Vile Entomber enters the battlefield, search your library for a card, put that card into your graveyard, and then shuffle. Again, I don't really need to give repetitive effects and why they're good, but definitely this is an uncommon that I just thought deserves some recognition that you pretty much wouldn't put in a deck otherwise. Next is the classic Entomb. So for 1 black at instant speed, we search our library for a card, put it into our graveyard. Again, don't really need to touch more on this, just wanted to bring up Entomb as it's a really good way to just consistently get a card into our graveyard. Next is Skull Prophet from Ikoria. So for black and a green, we get a 3/1 human druid that can tap for mana, so it taps for a black or a green, or we can tap it and put the top 2 cards of our library into our graveyard. It's a really nice effect in this deck as we can either use this to ramp out into Beamtown Bullies or another big creature, or we can just use it to fill our graveyard if we don't really like what's in there. Next is the Corpse Connoisseur. So for 4 and a black, we get a zombie wizard. When Corpse Connoisseur enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a creature card, put that card into your graveyard, and if you do, shuffle. Then it has Unearth for 3 and a black. Return this card from your graveyard to the battlefield. It gains haste. Exile it at the beginning of the next end step. If it would leave the battlefield, Unearth only as a sorcery. So this is just a way to get this effect twice. And the Unearth is obviously cheaper than its regular mana cost. Next is World Shaper. I've tried to throw this card into a few Merfolk decks, but honestly, it really works with things like Carador or Beamtown Bullies. So World Shaper is 3 and a green for the 4 mana. Whenever World Shaper attacks, you may mill 3 cards, so you do not have to. When World Shaper dies, return all land cards from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. So if we're just milling and milling and milling and dredging and all this and all that, World Shaper, we can have a sack outlet in the deck possibly, or just hold it back as a blocker, a really effective blocker, and we block with the World Shaper, it dies. We're going to just return everything. It does enter tapped unless we have something like an Amulet of Vigor. But basically, this is just going to say get all your land cards out, whereas Life from the Loam brings it back to our hand. World Shaper is just going to get those all out at once. Next is the Gravebreaker Lamia. So for 4 and a black, we get a enchantment creature Snake Lamia, very interesting creature type, with 4/4 with lifelink. When Gravebreaker Lamia enters the battlefield, search your library for a card, put it into your graveyard, and then shuffle. Spells you cast from your graveyard cost 1 less to cast. Not really sure what we're going to be casting straight from our graveyard, but this is just a nice way. It's a rare from the Theros set, so we're going to tutor a card to our graveyard, which is exactly what we want. And then it just has that text where we can, things from our graveyard cost 1 less if we're ever doing anything else in our deck that are getting played from our graveyard. Next is the Perpetual Timepiece, which is just a repetitive effect like the Skull Prophet. So for 2 mana, you get an artifact that you can tap immediately, whereas Skull Prophet has Summoning Sickness. So you put the top 2 cards of your library into your graveyard, and then we can pay 2, don't have to tap the Perpetual Timepiece. You exile the Perpetual Timepiece and shuffle any number of cards from our graveyard into our library, so we can shuffle in our lands or our legendary creatures that we want circulating back through our deck. So the Perpetual Timepiece is an uncommon from Kaladesh, which is just going to do some really heavy lifting in this deck. I wanted to talk about a card called 1000-Year Elixir. It's a 3 mana artifact that says you may activate abilities of creatures you control as though those creatures had haste, but you can pay 1 and tap the 1000-Year Elixir, and you can untap target creature. Now that leads us perfectly into our next segment of untapping effects. So the next card we're going to talk about is the classic Seedborn Muse. So for 5 mana, 3 green, we get a 2/4. Untap all other permanents during each other player's untap step. So that gives us 3 additional Beamtown Bully effects activated with Seedborn Muse. So this card is probably going to get killed or exiled most of, if not all the time, but it's insanely powerful. If it resolves and you can activate Beamtown Bullies 3 times before your next turn, you're pretty much winning the game at this point. Next is going to be Mage Right Stone. So for 2 mana, an artifact that says pay 1, tap the Mage Right Stone, untap target creature that has an activated ability with a tap in its cost. So this just untaps our commander, get another repetitive effect. Next is Puppet Strings. So for 3 mana, again, similar, pay 2 mana, tap Puppet Strings. You may tap or untap target creature. Staff of Domination. This definitely is an infinite combo piece in a lot of decks, so this might be out of some people's price ranges, but I wanted to include it just for one of its abilities. That is pay 3 mana, tap the Staff of Domination, untap target creature. And then we can pay 1 colorless mana and untap the Staff of Domination. So basically, if we can create infinite mana, it can be any color or colorless, we can then go infinite with tapping the Beamtown Bullies whenever we want. Next is Umbral Mantle. So for 3 mana, and we have to equip it, but its equipped cost is 0. So equipped creature has pay 3 and untap this creature, and this creature gets +2/+2 until end of turn. And the last one in our untap category is going to be Awakening. So for 2 green, it's an enchantment At the beginning of each player's upkeep, untap all creatures and lands. So this will be insanely powerful for the control decks, where you're basically giving them free turns on other people's turns, but hopefully we can turn the tide and make Awakening work for us, as we're going to untap our Beamtown Bullies, and we're going to give really powerful game-breaking creatures. Maybe you'll give those creatures to the control player, or something that says when this enters, they're going to sacrifice a land. So yes, the control player gets to untap, but they're going to have to pay for it. And the other niche card that I forgot to talk about for the Dredge category is actually a land, and this is why I didn't make it up in the Dredge category when I initially talked about it, is Dakmore Salvage. So it enters tapped, it taps for a black, but it's a land with Dredge too. So again, just another repetitive Dredge effect. I don't really need to bring up why Dredge is good and what we're doing with Dredge, but Dakmore Salvage is a land with Dredge. All right, and next up is definitely one of my favorite categories in any EDH deck. We're going to be talking about the good stuff. Now, the first thing in our good stuff category is going to be Flayer of the Hatebound. It's 5 and a red for 6 mana at 4/2. It is a devil with Undying. When this creature dies, if it had no 1/1 counters on it, return it to the battlefield under its owner's control with a +1/+1 counter on it. Whenever Flayer of the Hatebound or another creature enters the battlefield from your graveyard, that creature deals damage equal to its power to any target. So now it's whenever Flayer of the Hatebound or another creature enters the battlefield from your graveyard. So it doesn't say when a creature from your graveyard enters your battlefield. So when we're giving creatures away with Beamtown Bullies, Flayer of the Hatebound is also dealing damage. We can use that to control the board, or to just do player removal and start hitting our opponents with the straight damage. Next is going to be Underrealm Lich. So for 3 Golgari, so 3 black-green, we get a 4/3 Zombie Elf Shaman. If you would draw a card instead, look at the top 3 cards of your library, then put 1 into your hand and the rest into your graveyard. So we can grab our lands, our instants, our sorceries, and ditch our creatures just like we want to be doing. And then we can pay for life. Underrealm Lich gains indestructible until end of turn and tap it. So this thing is just really hard to get rid of. It has to be exiled, and as long as we have the life, we can just keep giving it indestructible. Next is going to be the Ramunap Excavator. Now, I didn't include Crucible of Worlds, but I guess we could talk about that, as they're just repetitive effects for same mana cost. So for 2 and a green, we get a Naga Cleric. You may play lands from your graveyard. Crucible of Worlds does the exact same effect, except it's an artifact, so it's harder to interact with. But I thought I would just talk about Ramunap Excavator because it's a creature, it's cheaper in terms of price-wise, and it's just easier to reanimate a creature than trying to get back an artifact into play or into our hand. All right, and next up, we're going to talk about just a few legendaries, the generals, the horsemen, as I like to call them in my EDH decks. We're not really going to include a whole lot of legendaries in this deck because the Beamtown Bullies don't interact with legendary creatures. We can't give them to our opponents, so we're going to have to find a way to either cast these, get them back, and have them on our battlefield, but we cannot reanimate them with the Beamtown Bullies. So the first one we're going to talk about is Old Stickfingers. So for X, black-green, we get a star legendary horror. When you cast this spell, reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal X creature cards. Put all creature cards revealed this way into your graveyard, then the rest at the bottom of your library in a random order. So Old Stickfinger's first ability is just filling our graveyard with creatures, which is exactly what we need, exactly what we want. And Old Stickfinger's power and toughness are equal to the number of creatures in our graveyard. So Old Stickfingers is basically just a sorcery with X that says, look at the top X, put the creature cards into our graveyard, and then he can come down and just be a blocker. We don't really need him to do anything else. So even if X can be something as big as 5, we're hopefully going to get some good value. And later on in the game, if X is even 0, he's 2 mana, and he can come down and just be a 10/10 if we have that many creatures in our graveyard. Next is going to be Sereth the Viper's Fang. So I included this in the legendary creatures section and not the untap section. But basically, Sereth is just here to untap our commander. Other tapped creatures you control have Death Touch, and other untapped creatures you control have Hexproof. So if we're waiting to activate our Beamtown Bullies on someone else's turn and Sereth is out, Beamtown Bullies is going to have Hexproof until we're ready to activate it. Then Sereth also says pay 1 and tap Sereth. Untap another target creature or land, so we can ramp maybe, but mostly we're going to be using this to activate Beamtown Bullies a second time. Now this takes us right into our other category called things that we want to give our opponents. So the first thing is going to be Inverter of Truth. So for 2 black, it's a 6/6 Eldrazi, so 4 mana at 6/6. It has Devoid, it has no colors, but there are black in its mana cost. It has Flying. When Inverter of Truth enters the battlefield, exile all cards from your library face down. Then shuffle all cards from your graveyard into your library. So we give this mythic to an opponent, and it basically just exiles their library and turns their graveyard into their library. It's insanely powerful. And if we do it to an opponent who barely has anything in their graveyard, we could just kick them out of the game by having them draw out. Next is the Ebonblade Reaper. So for 2 and a black, it's a 1/1 that says whenever Ebonblade Reaper attacks, you lose half your life rounded up. Whenever Ebonblade Reaper deals combat damage to a player, they lose half their life rounded up. So basically, you give this to an opponent, they are goaded, it has to attack, they're going to lose half their life rounded up, and then if they attack someone who doesn't have any blockers, they're going to lose half their life rounded up. And this is great incentive for a player who has to use it. They're going to lose half their life. They're going to want to hit someone else to make them lose half their life, so they're not the only one in the half-life boat. Next is the Bold Weir Heavyweight. So for 4 mana, 2 red, we get an 8/8 Giant Warrior with Trample. When Bold Weir Heavyweights comes into play, each opponent may search his or her library for a creature card and put it into play. Then if they search the library, you shuffle it, yada yada. But basically, this is going to allow us to grab creatures that we want to put into play on our battlefield, but we need to be careful because it gives the other opponents the chance to search their library and maybe even get out a combo piece or something that shuts us down. So just be careful with Bold Weir Heavyweights. It's a great card. It's really powerful, but it's powerful for everyone else, not just you. Now, this card actually is the card that broke this deck. When Beamtown Bullies were spoiled and talked about, this was the card that jumped up in price and everyone was talking about it. Hellcarver Demon. So for 3 black, you get a 6/6 flyer. Whenever Hellcarver Demon deals combat damage to a player, sacrifice all other permanents you control and discard your hand. Period. That is just a brutal effect right there. Exile the top 6 cards of your library. You may cast any number of non-land cards exiled this way without paying their mana cost. So I guess somewhat it kind of rewards the player who's dealing damage, but they sacrifice all other permanents, including lands, and they discard their current hand. It just messes with them completely. Next is Leveler. So for 5 colorless mana, you get a 10/10 creature. When Leveler comes into play, remove your library from the game. That's it. You give it to an opponent, say bye to their library. It doesn't say exile. I'm not sure how this card works. I don't know if you move it to an exile zone, but it doesn't say put your library into your graveyard so they have access to it. You remove it from the game. Next is Eater of Days. So for 4 mana, you get a 9/8 flying trample. When Eater of Days comes into play, you skip your next 2 turns. So it's not on cast. You just bring it into play and you say, hey, you're being mean to me or you're about to win. You're skipping your next 2 turns. You're setting yourself up for victory with this card. Next is Bronze Bombshell. For 4 mana, you get a 4/1. When a player other than Bronze Bombshell's owner controls it, that player sacrifices it. If that player does, Bronze Bombshell deals 7 damage to him or her. This isn't exactly one of the big hitters in this list, but if you just need to deal 7 damage to someone, it's cheap. It's just kind of a slot in the deck. I thought I'd talk about it. I've never even heard of this card, so I wanted to bring it up. Next is Phyrexian Negator. Really creepy art. So for 2 and a black, we get a 5/5 horror with trample, which is always nice to have on a goaded creature. Whenever Phyrexian Negator is dealt damage, sacrifice that many permanents. So if they block with a 1/1, the person who controls the Phyrexian Negator has to sack that many permanents, but if they block with anything higher, then, if they block with their 10/10 or whatnot. So however many points of damage the Negator gets, they have to sacrifice that many permanents. Next is the Pathrazer of Ulamog. So for 11 mana, you get a 9/9. It has Annihilator 3. Whenever this creature attacks, defending player sacrifices 3 permanents. Pathrazer of Ulamog can't be blocked except by 3 or more creatures. So this thing is basically just saying, hey, I'm going to try and deal as much damage as I can. And by the way, you have to sacrifice 3 permanents. So they can be lands, but this thing is just brutal with the Annihilator triggers. Next is the Tempting Worm. So for 2 mana, you can get a 5/5. When Tempting Worm comes into play, each opponent may put any number of artifact, creature, enchantment, and or lands from their hand into their library. So just like the Bold Weir Heavyweights, you really need to be careful with the Tempting Worm because this thing is going to give everyone if you're playing against a player who's just doing big mana spells and they're holding it all in their hands, and you make an opponent have this at the wrong time, they dump their hand, they could just start controlling the game rather than you. Next is Dragon Mage. So I included this. I thought it was interesting because with the when Dragon Mage deals combat damage to a player, each player discards their hand and draws 7 cards. So if you either have really good creatures in your hand that you need to get in your graveyard, or you just want to see some new cards, you give Dragon Mage to someone else, it's goaded, it's going to try and hit someone, deal combat damage, especially if there's no other flyers around, and then everybody gets to discard and draw, so that's going to be more beneficial for you. Next is everyone's favorite, Master of Cruelties. So it's a 1/4 demon with first strike and death touch. When Master of Cruelties can only attack alone. Whenever Master of Cruelties attacks a player that isn't blocked, that player's life total becomes 1. Master of Cruelties assigns no combat damage. So this thing is just going to set someone to 1, and they're going to be at the mercy of the rest of the table. Next is the Hunted Wumpus. So it's an uncommon, but it's 3 and a green. When Hunted Wumpus enters the battlefield, each other player may put a creature card from their hand onto the battlefield. Again, with Boulder Heavyweights and the Tempting Worm, you just need to be careful with this kind of effect as to not give your opponents the upper hand, but I thought I'd include it in this list anyway. Next is the Enslaved Horror. So for 3 and a black, when Enslaved Horror comes into play, each other player may return a creature from his or her graveyard to play. So hopefully our graveyard is way more stacked than anyone else's, and we're just going to be able to take advantage of that with the Enslaved Horror by giving it to someone else, goading it, and then we get to get a really good creature back on our side of the field. And lastly is the Lesser Gargadon. So for 2 red, we get a 6/4 beast. Whenever Lesser Gargadon attacks or blocks, sacrifice a land. So with the goad, it has to attack, so you just give this to someone else, and maybe you give it to the person who is super far ahead of everyone else on lands. Maybe it's the green player who's just been ramping, or maybe it's the control player who just hit 6 lands and you want to set them back just a little bit so they have a little bit less mana to control the game with. The Lesser Gargadon is going to be able to make them sacrifice a land. So that is actually going to do it for our Commander Quick Look on the Beamtown Bullies. I hope you had as much fun watching this video as I had making it. I really like the Beamtown Bullies and just what they do in Jund. It's so on point and on theme with what Jund does, but it's doing it in a different way, which is so fun to see at the Commander table. Just, you never really know what's going to happen with the Beamtown Bullies. It influences combat by making your opponents have to swing at each other, and it's going to give you and your other opponents some really cool effects. So there's just a lot to do with this deck, and this deck honestly reminds me of a Muldrotha deck, but instead of that blue, we obviously have red, and it's just really cool to see how Wizards is making cards like this where they're just, it's fun, it's obviously powerful, but I don't know if it's CEDH broken, but it's definitely fun, and it leads to some really cool deck building paths that aren't just natural Jund. So you'll always love seeing that. I've been your host, Azarain. Check me out on YouTube, like and subscribe. Make sure, leave a comment down below if you like the Beamtown Bullies or what legendary creature you want to see a Commander Quick Look of next. I'm really going to try and keep on my video creation schedule. There's just a lot happening in my personal life, but I hope to make some more quality content. We're going to get some more Commander stuff. We're going to get some more Quick Looks, hopefully some physical Commander gameplay soon. Thanks for your support, and we'll see you next time.